October 27th, 1962, somewhere in the Atlantic. The captain of a Soviet submarine has ordered a nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. He believes the war has already started. The political officer agrees. 2 of the 3 required authorizations are yes. The weapon has the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The 3rd man hasn't answered yet. His name is Vasily Arkhipov. He is the brigade's chief of staff, the senior officer across the entire 4-submarine flotilla. His presence aboard B-59 is a matter of chance. As chief of staff, he had to be on one of the 4 submarines. This is where chance placed him. To understand why the first 2 votes were yes, you have to understand what the submarine had been through. Submerged for days, cut off from all radio contact with Moscow, the crew of 78 does not know that Kennedy and Khrushchev are negotiating. American destroyers have been dropping depth charges directly above them for hours. Temperature inside 45 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide rising, several crew members already unconscious. The captain has concluded that war has already begun. So has the political officer. Given what they know, the reasoning is coherent. He says no. By the end of this video, you'll understand what actually happened inside submarine B-59 on October 27, 1962. The documented version, drawn from archives partially opened after 1991, different in important ways from what circulated for 40 years. You'll understand why one officer said no when every pressure available to a human being was pushing him to say yes. The psychology of what he did is more interesting than courage and considerably more useful. And there's a third thing, something the standard Cold War histories skip entirely. Arkhipov had been in a situation like this before, 14 months earlier, on a different submarine in a different crisis. What happened then is why he was the person he was on October 27th. We'll get there. To understand what Arkhipov faced, you have to understand what the 4 submarines of the Soviet Foxtrot-class flotilla had been through by October 27th. They had departed from Kola Bay in early October, ordered to the Caribbean in secret. The mission parameters were deliberately vague. They knew a confrontation between the superpowers was developing. Once submerged, their communication with Moscow was intermittent at best and had been effectively cut for days. The U.S. Navy had located them. Practice depth charges, signaling devices rather than weapons, were being dropped to force the submarines to surface. The Soviet crews had no way of knowing they were practice charges. From inside a submarine being depth charged, the distinction between a signal and an attack is not immediately apparent. Captain Savitsky's reasoning, reconstructed from crew accounts and documented in the National Security Archive's 2002 Havana Conference transcripts, was coherent given what he knew. American warships were attacking his vessel. Radio silence from Moscow, the crisis had apparently escalated to open conflict. Under those conditions, the nuclear torpedo was a response rather than an escalation. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, reached the same conclusion. 2 of the 3 required votes were yes. Under extreme group pressure, in conditions of high stress and information deprivation, individuals tend to converge on the dominant interpretation of a situation rather than hold a dissenting position. The research on this is consistent. So did every major study of isolated decision-making that followed. The more uniform the stress, the stronger that tendency becomes. Arkhipov was under identical conditions, the same heat, the same carbon dioxide, the same depth charges, the same certainty in the faces of the 2 men across from him. He said no anyway. In 1961, the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram ran a series of experiments on obedience to authority. The basic finding is well known. Ordinary people, when instructed by an authority figure, administered what they believed to be dangerous electric shocks to strangers at rates that shocked nearly everyone who reviewed the data. The less discussed finding is the one that matters here. When Milgram introduced a single dissenting voice into the experiment, one Confederate who refused to continue before the subject had to make their own decision, compliance dropped from 65% to 10%. One person saying no out loud before the critical moment changed what other people did. Arkhipov did not have the benefit of a prior dissenter. There was no one in that submarine who had already said no. He had to be the first. The research on what enables that, what allows an individual to hold a dissenting position under maximum conformity pressure, points consistently to one variable: prior experience of having survived a moment when the dominant group interpretation turned out to be wrong. Arkhipov had exactly that experience, and it had happened 14 months earlier on a submarine called K-19. K-19 was the Soviet Union's first nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine. On July 4, 1961, its reactor cooling system failed. The reactor temperature began climbing toward meltdown. 8 men volunteered to enter the reactor compartment and improvise a repair using materials not designed for the purpose. All 8 died of radiation exposure within weeks. The ship was saved. Arkhipov was the executive officer aboard K-19. He was present for the entire crisis. He watched 8 men die to prevent a catastrophe that the ship's command structure had initially failed to anticipate. He understood from direct experience that the situation as presented by authority is not always the situation as it actually is, that the instruments can be wrong. That saying, wait, carries its own form of courage. The account of what happened aboard B-59 on the night of October 27th comes primarily from Vadim Orlov, head of the radio intercept unit on B-59, whose recollections were published in 2002 and confirmed in detail by Ryurik Ketov, commander of a companion submarine after his declassification clearance in 2005. The critical moment did not happen in the command room. It happened on the conning tower. The submarine had surfaced in darkness to recharge its batteries, a necessary operation it could no longer delay. Savitsky went up to the tower with Arkhipov. What met them was a wall of light and sound. American planes flying 20 to 30 meters above the conning tower, searchlights, cannon fire of more than 300 shells, destroyers cutting across the bow at dangerously close range. Savitsky, according to Orlov's account, was shocked and blinded. He concluded in that moment that the Americans were attacking. He called for an emergency dive and ordered the preparation of the nuclear torpedo. His words, as Orlov recorded them, "We will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." He was temporarily blocked on the narrow stairway of the conning tower. Arkhipov was still on deck. From there, he could see what Savitsky, already descending, could not. The Americans were not attacking. They were signaling. Arkhipov called the commander back. He calmed him down. Savitsky's order was never transmitted to the officer in charge of the torpedo. The submarine signaled back to the American forces to cease their provocative actions. The situation was defused. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive and one of the organizers of the 2002 Havana Conference, said afterward, "A man named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." Stop for a second. Have you ever been in a room, a meeting, a family situation, a moment at work, where everyone was moving toward a decision and you were the only one who had doubts? What did you do? I want to know, because the research on this is very specific about what makes the difference. Drop it in the comments. This channel publishes one documentary a week. If you want the next one when it comes out, subscribing is the most reliable way to find it. Now, what the historical record shows about what happened to Arkhipov afterward, because that part is not a comfortable story. The 4 submarines returned to the Soviet Union in November 1962. There was no public acknowledgement of what had happened aboard B-59. The nuclear torpedo was absent from both the Soviet and American official accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis. For decades, neither side had a complete picture of how close October 27th had come. Arkhipov continued his naval career. He rose to the rank of vice admiral. He was never publicly recognized for what he had done, because what he had done was officially a secret, and because recognizing it would have required acknowledging that the decision to fire had nearly been taken. The Soviet Navy's internal assessment of the B-59 incident treated what happened as a procedural matter. The launch protocol functioned as designed, the required unanimity was not achieved, the submarine surfaced. There is no document that describes Arkhipov as having prevented a nuclear exchange. What he did was recorded as the correct application of procedure. The institution absorbed the act and gave it a different name. The fuller account only became possible after the Soviet collapse. The 2002 Havana Conference, attended by former American, Soviet, and Cuban officials, produced the most complete reconstruction available. It was there that the American side learned for the first time about the nuclear torpedo, the 3-officer protocol, and what had happened in the command room of B-59. Robert McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense during the crisis, was at the Havana Conference. Hearing the account of B-59 for the first time 40 years after the fact, he said, "We came so close, my God." Arkhipov died in 1998, 4 years before the conference that established what he had done. His wife, Elena Arkhipova, attended in 2002. She had known for 40 years. She had known and said nothing because he had said nothing. Back to October 27, 1962. The depth charges continued for several hours after Arkhipov said no. The argument in the command room ended. The submarine surfaced in darkness in the middle of the American naval cordon, surrounded by destroyers that had been hunting it for days. The crew were exhausted, oxygen depleted, several of them barely conscious. What Arkhipov had done, in the most precise terms the psychological research makes available, was this. He had maintained his own assessment of the situation under conditions specifically designed to erode it. His certainty was not the point. By his own account, he did not know whether war had begun. He said no because he did not know enough to say yes. The burden of proof for him ran in the other direction. He kept a small, specific space of uncertainty open at the moment when every pressure in his environment was pushing him to close it. That space was the distance between a conning tower and a stairway on a submarine in the Atlantic in October 1962. It was enough. Arkhipov had a framework, a protocol, a prior experience that told him what institutional certainty could cost. He used all of it. Next week, what happens when there is no framework left at all? Virginia, 1609, the first permanent English settlement in America, a winter that killed more than 200 people, and what the survivors did, and what the Virginia Company did with the account of it afterward. The archaeology confirmed it in 2012. The history books had a different version for 400 years. That's next week.